Okay. I want to welcome you to our IPMA webinar, Growing New Teams for Greatness. This is hosted. I'm going to turn this over to Dwayne McGee. He's Messiah College Director for Print and Mail, and he's also the IPMA Board President. Welcome, Dwayne.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to start by introducing everyone to Dr. Allen, but I'm going to do it a little bit differently. You've all had a chance to read his biography in our marketing pieces for this webinar. You all are actually going to meet Dr. Allen in much the same way that I met him. I was sitting in my office about a year ago facing a situation where we had possibly 3, maybe 4 retirements coming up in my department, and you know, it's one of those things that keep you up at night. How are we going to replace these people with the next generation of workers? What's my team going to look like 5 years from now? And our Human Resources office invited me to an event where Dr. Allen was speaking on a topic very similar to what we're talking about today. And I went into that meeting knowing about how much you know about Dr. Allen as I did then. So we both, you all and me, we kind of came at this in the same direction. So you're going to meet Dr. Allen throughout the course of this conversation. And when you're all done, you're all going to wish that you had his personal email and cell phone number to call him because he's very inspiring. I left that meeting no longer being kept up at night by how I was going to be replacing my next generation of employees, but when could I get started? So Dr. Allen, thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I have received several questions from attendees today about some of the information that we included in your biography. People are asking me about these tours that we mentioned. In the marketing materials, they're called Returning to the Roots of the Civil Rights Bus Tour. Can you briefly tell us what those are and how people can learn more about them?
Sure, Dwayne. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to everyone at IPMA. When I'm not in the classroom teaching, I'm a communication studies professor by background. For the last 17 years, I've led what's called Returning to the Roots of Civil Rights. It's about an 8 or 9 day bus tour to key southern sites of the civil rights movement. I started this through a nonprofit called the Common Ground Project, but really its genesis goes back to my time in high school. I grew up learning the history of the movement as one way to understand, I guess, what we call issues of diversity today. And I thought every kid in the United States had that kind of educational experience. When I went to college, I realized how unique that was. And so about 17 years ago, I had the opportunity talking with actually a former teacher from high school to take people on these places, to visit these places. And she strongly encouraged me. In fact, she went on one of the very first tours that I led. And it's hard to believe here we sit 17 years later. We are one of, I believe there's one other organization in the United States that's been doing these trips as long. And I just say that it's a way to engage, our shared history of the past. It's one thing to read a book, and there's some good books, and watch some great films and documentaries, but it's a whole other powerful moment to be in those places where the history happened. And I'm just glad that I've been placed in a position where I can give people that opportunity.
Yeah, I've talked to several people who have been on the tours, and they're very inspired when they come back. I'm excited to get my name on the list to be able to attend.
Well, we'd love to have you, and we'd love to again have anyone from IPMA. It is something that it's not just open to college folk; it's open to whosoever is interested.
So also in your biography, we see that you have extensive experience as a diversity and inclusive excellence trainer. Because much of what we talk about over the next 30 minutes or so will include some of these terms, I thought it might be great for us to first talk about those terms, diversity and inclusive excellence. I've also heard occasionally the phrase cultural intelligence in certain conversations that are similar to the one we're having today. These terms, these phrases come up. and I just want to make sure that when we hear them, we're all on the same page. So could you help us define some of those?
Sure. I'm actually, as I said, really excited to spend some time this afternoon to explore how we can create workplaces that are more diverse and more inclusive, and why this matters not only for our future, but for our present. Now, we could probably spend all day defining these terms, but I want to share this and say that there is no one single definition or best definition of these terms, and sometimes that's what can make the conversation itself difficult. But thinking about diversity, first of all, as you see, it says it's the collective mixture of differences and similarities that includes, for example, individual and organizational characteristics, values, beliefs, experiences, backgrounds, preferences, and behaviors. Diversity itself is a very broad and evolving concept, defined as the presence and participation of people who differ. Diversity includes such interrelated dimensions of our human identity as race and ethnicity, gender, sex, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, nationality, religion, ability level. In fact, I was just reading a great article the other day on neurodiversity and the various ways in which we think in our learning styles, just to name a few. I think what's important for any organization that wants to engage this diversity conversation is to think about how is your organization defining diversity. Because what it means in one location could mean something completely different in another. I was sitting with an organization the other day, and we were having conversations about how they could diversify their workforce, and that was one of the things I said to them. Well, what do you mean in this geographic location when you say diversity? And they said, well, for us, the largest community here is Latino. And so I was like, okay, so not that you're only focused on, Latino recruitment, but if definitely that's a demographic that's right here in your backyard, but they're not showing up in your workplace, what are some things targeted that you can do to enhance Latino recruitment for you, as an example? And closely related to then how you're defining diversity, then goes back to what are the diversity needs, I guess you can say, of your organization. So 2 questions to think about for an organization when they're thinking about diversity. Now, as I said, while diversity is the presence of difference, diversity is not inclusion. In a great book called The Inclusion Dividend, Kaplan and Donovan make the point that inclusion is the extent to which diverse groups of people have a seat at the table and they're able to bring their best contributions. Compositional diversity is just the first step to becoming a more culturally inclusive or culturally intelligent workplace. It's an important step, but it's just the first step. Once we have compositional diversity, once we begin to develop that, what tools do we need to help our employees to flourish? And inclusion then raises that question of what structures, systems, policies are we putting in place to make sure that not only that people are on our workforce, but that they've got seats at the table, that they're valued. And that's where you're getting into talking about issues of talent acquisition, but then also talent management. How do we, once we've acquired these employees, how do we help them to grow, develop them, engage them, make sure that our culture, our cultural climate of our organization is open to difference?
Yeah, I think that's what resonated with me when I first heard you speak on this topic. I think when I thought about my workforce, I thought, well, I've got 13 employees. They have 13 different histories and backgrounds and family lives. So I have a diverse working team here. But after hearing you speak, I realized that that was a very elementary and basic level of understanding in terms of diversity.
Well, on the one hand, yes, but it is important to acknowledge that not only does your organization have a culture, but the individuals within that organization also bring a sense of culture or cultural identity. The degree to which that they may or may not be aware of that can vary, but it also then impacts, as you said, as we're trying to expand, as we're trying to recruit new people into to our place. Are we recruiting people? One of the phrases that's sometimes used is, "Do they fit?" And I really challenge people to ask themselves, what do they mean when they say that word fit? And I know we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but to me the goal is to disrupt the fit.
Right.
Because sometimes when we're looking for a fit, we're looking for people who are quote unquote just like me.
Right.
And that doesn't shake up, the culture in any way, shape, or form. And if we talk about, being leaders in our industry, we've got to start moving away from fit to being more change agent oriented. But I give you an example. I come at this issue from, as I said, a higher ed background, though I've worked in other arenas on this as well. But a perfect example of the difference between diversity and inclusion. And maybe it wasn't inclusion in its fullest sense, but so when I was in college, I did an internship in Washington, D.C. I was a broadcast major, and we were working on an awards program. And so I was just there kind of as a little gopher, if you will, very low on the totem pole, if on the pole at all, right? I brought along with some other interns were there, a certain level of diversity. We brought a presence of difference both in terms of our age, in terms of our ethnicity, in terms of our knowledge, but we really weren't included. We were kind of temp help. But I remember a moment came when they were having the last production meeting before the show was going to be produced that night. And so we were all invited to come into the boardroom just to kind of watch a production meeting. So we were in the room, but literally not at the table. And at one point, they're going through the program for the evening. And the producer says, now, one of the awards recipients, I believe she's African American. When she goes up to accept her award, she wants the orchestra to play the Negro National Anthem. And all of a sudden, all of these people looked around the room, and there might have been probably 40 people in the room, 2 African Americans, myself, and another young man. That was it. And it was as though in a moment they all kind of looked at us, and I looked at them and I said, that would be lift every voice and sing. And I remember the producer kind of snapping his fingers to another gopher to run out to get that sheet music so they could play it. I just often wonder, and this was obviously in the days before you could Google and ask Alexa and all these kinds of things. I wonder what they would have done, how they would have gotten that question answered. But to me, it just really reminds me of the importance of being included as well. So
you mentioned in some of what we were just talking about, you said the word cultural intelligence. Would it be good to talk about that now, or should I move on to the meat of this conversation, and then that will come up a little bit?
I think it'll come up as we go forward.
So according to something I recently read from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the median age of workers in our industry, for most people on this call, the printing industry, is now almost 50 years old. In light of this news, it is reasonable to assume that many of our experienced in-plant employees will soon be retiring. Managers like me are already starting to think about the next generation of employees and leaders. A typical process for finding new employees is fairly basic and commonly understood to be the way things are done. You write a job description, you advertise in the newspaper or maybe a few other places, you wait for applications and hope that someone who is qualified applies. You conduct interviews and review resumes, and you hire what you consider, based on your experience over those last 4 steps, who might be the most qualified candidate. Now, in that traditional process, is that optimal, or are we missing some potential opportunities by following those traditional steps?
Well, I mean, I think you say yourself there in your answer. It's traditional. It's what we are used to doing. It's what was done in the past, and not that the past is to be dismissed. But as you talk about moving into this new phase, as you talk about growing into greatness, maybe that means you're going to have to do some things a little bit differently as well. I mean, using that as a foundation of a process, but how can we enhance that foundation? Now, as an educator, sometimes I like to ask more questions than I answer. Some questions that I would think about as I'm going through that process. If those statistics are correct about age, all right. So one of the dynamics then is, how do we get younger employees into the field, interested into the field? I would encourage companies to ask themselves, what is your organization doing right now to engage either any younger employees that you have, Getting to know what are the things that workers in their 20s and 30s are most interested in, and how can you incentivize them. But even before you get to the level of employees, what kind of outreach are you doing to those generations in high school to get them interested in and engaged in the field? What kind of vision, I guess you can say, are you casting for those future employees? Is important to think about. One of the things that I've become fascinated with, one of the subjects I've become fascinated with in the last few years is the role of bias in our cultural understanding process. A great book that I read some time ago and I'd recommend to others is Everyday Bias by Howard Ross. And he says several rich things in there. One, he says, we see something and our mind automatically sorts it, consciously or unconsciously, saying that reminds me of, as a way of identifying what we're dealing with at that moment. Now, sometimes when people hear bias, they think automatically, well, bias, that's something that bad people have. Bad people are biased. No, people are biased. It's just a way of organizing information. Now, I know sometimes people have also, recently, Starbucks, for example, closed down for a day of implicit bias training or discussion. And some people have said, well, implicit bias, that's just going a soft way of saying discrimination is out there. And rather than calling out discrimination, you're trying to put a pretty sounding name on it. I don't think so. To me, again, bias is thinking about what are some things that I do unconsciously, but also, as Ross mentions, maybe even sometimes consciously, that might be impeding the development of the workplace that I want. Things to think about as far as implicit bias are concerned. It's pervasive. As I said, everybody has biases. It's not something that just bad people have. But sometimes we can have biases that don't necessarily align with our declared beliefs. Like I can say I believe in equality between men and women, but yet as a manager, I might treat my male employees one way, and I might treat my female employees in an entirely different way. In fact, in a way that disadvantages them. We tend to have biases that favor our own in-groups. So that's where I go back to that idea of, looking for a fit. Sometimes one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is they mistake fitness and qualifications. And so when I see someone or I interview a candidate who reminds me of me, I will think that they're more qualified than perhaps they really are. And then when I'm engaging with a candidate who doesn't remind me of me, I might think that they're less qualified when in fact the opposite, could indeed be true. Now, the great thing about biases is that, they can be changed over time. They can be changed over time. So one of the things I would say about the hiring process is to think about what biases might be built in to our work culture that are inhibiting us perhaps from being a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So, for example, when we're writing job descriptions, are we writing them in a way that favors some and disadvantages others? Are we, the interview questions that we ask, or even the responses that we're looking for, are the interpretations that we give those responses? I was talking with someone recently, and they were telling me about an interview situation where a choice was being made between candidates, and some in the room said, "Well, I didn't hear the candidate say X." And someone else on the committee said, "No, they said exactly that. They may not have used those words you were looking for, but they said it. But because it wasn't the words that or how we would say it, right, we thought they didn't say it at all." And then that caused, that committee to go a different direction. I think it's important in our hiring, if we're serious about being a more diverse workplace. I just read a great article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed titled "How Serious Are You About Diversity Hiring?" And one of the things they mention is the importance of, quote unquote, interrupting the usual. So back to those steps that you said that we normally do. All those steps are important, but then we've got to ask ourselves, what are some ways we can interrupt this to get the result that we want? Maybe it's having your search committees before they actually launch out into a search. Go through a seminar or a workshop on implicit bias and think about what are some biases that are part of our organizational culture that, because we live it and experience it so much on a regular basis, we're not even aware that those are biases. To review again our hiring procedures, everything from the wording of job descriptions to where we place ads. Thinking about this, the age demographic, where are the young people today looking at job opportunities versus where were they looking in our generation or generations before? And I can tell you the newspaper's not it. Right?
That's not the answer I wanted to hear.
As we think about employment criteria, really, really asking ourselves, what are the must-haves that I need from an employee to do this job versus what are the nice-to-haves? Because sometimes we act like these nice-haves are the must-haves, and they're really not. Another thing I've seen sometimes that companies have done in the desire for fit. I've been a part of many search committees in my lifetime, both being on the committee and then being the one interviewed. And sometimes, we do these interviews and we're asking questions of candidates like, we're going to be the best of friends outside of work and hang out together every weekend. And then you actually get the job and you probably maybe socialize with those people 2 times a year. And so, just again, even there, sometimes the way in which we structure our interviews, while we may think it's being very inclusive, it's not.
So I've heard you say in other conversations that we've had, there's a certain importance also to what you're doing before it even becomes time to start a hiring process or to have before the position's even vacant. And you've talked about the importance of networking.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah. Again, the time to think about having that diverse pool of candidates for your job is not after you've written the job description and you're now ready to send it out. You're almost, I don't want to say too late, but it's very, very late in the process. It's going back to thinking about, you mentioned when we first met that you knew in the years to come that you're going to have some openings. Not to say that there, might not be circumstances that would accelerate and, move that clock up a little bit, but the time to begin recruiting and keeping your eye on talent for those positions is not 5 years from now when that opening is going to be, but right now, and maybe even grooming or growing that talent that you want for your place. Because sometimes, particularly, you're talking about certain kinds of diversity, depending on where your company or organization might be located. It will take some time of convincing to get someone to maybe move to your area, or just the dynamics of people's lives. And it goes back to this idea, and I guess this is, kind of comes out of my passion in the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, for many of us, we live such segregated lives outside of the workplace. We live in communities that can have a tendency to be very homogeneous. We go to churches that tend to be homogeneous. We shop in neighborhoods or attend schools that are homogeneous, and then we go to work, and the workplace might be homogeneous, and then we wonder why, quote unquote, we can't find any, right? Because we're not interacting inside of work or outside of work, or very little interaction inside of work or outside of work with folk that are different. And so, definitely, I think, organizations, and particularly leadership in those organizations, it's one thing to put out a mandate, I guess, if you will, or to put in your mission that we will be diverse and inclusive. It's a whole other thing to model that, and you model that by who you're engaging in business with and in encounters with.
I was hoping that you wouldn't say, well, you have to step outside your comfort zone, but you just said that.
Oh, you've got to. Again, it's about that idea of interrupting the usual, and that doesn't make people comfortable. But we see the benefits of stepping outside what we're used to. There was a phrase I learned a long time ago, and excuse the sexism within it, but it says, if you never leave your father's farm, you'll think that his farm's the biggest in all the world. Meaning, if you never step outside of your comfort zone, out of your cultural comfort zone, whatever that might be, you tend to think that that's the best thing going. And in fact, you will then assess other cultures by how well or how poorly they match up to your father's farm. And of course, they match up poorly because they're not from that farm. We've got to learn to step outside.
Yeah, that comes back to networking, and it's one of the things I'm proud about with IPMA is once a year we get to step outside of our farms and visit each other, and you learn a lot talking to people who are running shops in other, not just other, for me, you know, finding people who are printing in higher ed, but looking at other industry segments as well. So I can get your point for sure. So if we step outside of our routine, we potentially deepen the pool of applicants. Not only that, it's not just more applicants, it becomes a more diverse applicant pool, and subsequently we begin to create a more diverse department. But there I go again using the word diverse. Dr. Allen, can you tell us what you believe are the benefits for having a diverse team of employees? Based on our definition of diversity, how does that impact a team of workers, and what benefits does diversity bring to a team?
Well, sure. I think, you know, but before I jump specifically to kind of the bonuses, I guess you can say, of diversity, it's important to know that, as I said before, diversity is just the first part.
Mm-hmm.
You know, talent acquisition, expanding the pool is just the first step. Then it's talent development once you have people here. And, you know, sometimes what will happen in organizations is, you know, they went out on a search and maybe they found that diverse candidate they were looking for. They did nothing at all, though, to prepare the culture of their organization or their department to be embracing of diversity or inclusion. And so they bring this person in, whomever they might be, and they find that, you know, that person is one of, you know, the only one, you know, and because the culture hasn't changed, and because the culture maybe has not embraced difference, because the culture has not seen diversity as a bonus, that person has a tough go of it, and might even eventually leave the organization. And then the fallback is, well, see, we tried, but they couldn't stick it out. And that's, to me, just one of the most, you know, offensive of shifting the blame. There's been some great research done out there in the areas of the types of bias that can occur in the workplace on race and on gender and even on ability when it comes to talent development. You know, like who gets mentored and who doesn't, who's perceived as competent and qualified automatically versus who are the employees that we feel they need to prove their ability. I was reading a study recently looking at racial bias, for example, of applicants. And so, you know, what they did is they had two candidates, same resume, and they put quote unquote an African American sounding name on one of the applications, and then a Caucasian sounding name on the other. And it was not a surprise to me, and I don't think it was a surprise to the researchers, that consistently candidates with the Caucasian sounding name were called for interviews, while candidates with the name of a person of color were not called as frequent. It was the same resume.
Right.
It was the same resume,
Wow.
same application. I mean, I remember from my own personal experiences of having been interviewed. One time I was interviewed for a board position. And if I hadn't dragged the interview out, I think it would have been over in 10 minutes. And it wasn't because I wasn't qualified. I realized quickly when I got in the room, I was never there to be a serious candidate. I was there so they could say that they had a diverse candidate in the pool.
Yeah.
But there was never any intention of hiring someone like me. I say that not because I'm angry. I say that not for empathy. I say that because it's real. It happened and it continues to happen, and we need to be mindful of that. But you asked me about this idea of the benefits of diversity. You often hear people talk about making a business case for diversity. As you say, given that the pool of potential workers and consumers are going to be changing in so many ways, and not even necessarily going to be changing, have changed, it's important for us in the businesses that we're in to be able to tap into future employees as well as future customers or consumers. I was mentioned before that I had read an interesting article recently about this field of study called neurodiversity, looking at the varying ways in which persons across learning styles and learning abilities, the contributions they can bring to the workplace. It was a piece in the Harvard Business Review that was talking about a software corporation, and they realized in research that with people with dyslexia work exceptionally well with 3D modeling, and people with autism are drawn to systems and parts, making them very compatible, in fact, even more compatible, working with certain computer and technology sorts of jobs. So again, with this idea of diversity is much more expansive than just race, ethnicity, gender, but it's finding people who can do the job and finding ways to include them, perhaps in areas where we wouldn't have looked before.
We have a lot of in-plant print and mail leaders on the webinar right now, and they might be thinking what I'm thinking or asking myself. So what do I have to change about myself so that I can begin to think about my print shop being more creative, more effective? Is there something I can do as a leader now that will make my shop newer, better, different 3 to 5 years from now? So this becomes a bigger conversation than just how am I going to fill that hole where that employee just left, retired, whatever. How am I going to not just plug that hole with another body, but step back and actually look at my team and what my department looks like. It seems to me like this is going to be a very difficult job in front of me. So do you have any advice for us as we think about this and as we start examining our own biases and our own processes in our organizations?
Sure. No, I'm well aware that this sounds like some very heavy stuff. And sometimes and some days it can be. There are a variety of core competencies that I think leaders, effective leaders, need. And one of those core competencies, in my opinion, is this concept of cultural intelligence. You may have heard some people talk about it from the lens of cultural competency or cultural awareness. I like the language of cultural intelligence. David Livermore and his folks at the Cultural Intelligence Center have put out some outstanding research, accessible research on the importance of cultural intelligence. And what it is simply is the capability to function effectively in a variety of cultural contexts. It's reaching across the chasm of cultural difference in ways that are loving and that are respectful. And I think any employer wants a workplace where people are valued, where people are respected, where people are acknowledged. So what kind of things can leaders do? I think individual awareness of that leader is important. I said before, that do your words as a leader match your actions. If you're going to talk the talk, you've got to be able to make sure that you're walking the walk. How do you as a leader cast the vision, articulate the vision of what diversity and inclusion or equity and inclusion, whatever the lingo is that you're using? How do you cast that vision and share that vision with your employees on a regular basis as part of who you are? That you take a critical look at the culture of the organization, and ask yourself in a very honest way, what are components, characteristics of our organizational culture that are strengths for us when it comes to being a more diverse and inclusively excellent workplace, and what are our challenges, and acknowledging those challenges and committing to working to change those challenges. The thing I like about cultural intelligence as a framework for having this conversation is that it emphasizes the fact that awareness is an important step, but it's just the first step. Awareness alone is not enough. The cultural intelligence is something that we can learn. It's a learned capability. Now, I'm going to go through these next couple of slides quickly, but again, if you've got the website there for the Cultural Intelligence Center, this will give you all the richness that you need. But Livermore talks about this idea of really asking or wrestling with what is our CQ drive or what is our motivation for engaging with cultural differences. You know, it kind of goes back to the question you asked about what are the benefits or what are the bonuses of diversity. You know, part of assessing a leader assessing their own or assessing the CQ drive of their organization is asking what are their perceptions of or thoughts about diversity and cultural difference. That may mean wrestling with those feelings of ethnocentrism, you know, that I mentioned before when I talked about, you know, your father's farm, or what are the things that just make us apprehensive about engaging difference. What have been our own experiences as an organization or as individuals, and how do those shape the way that we respond to others? Our CQ knowledge, you know, oftentimes in the area of cultural intelligence or cultural understanding, we place a great emphasis on learning the culture of the other. And that's important. I mean, again, if you're going to value and respect someone, you need to learn about them. But sometimes we do that to the detriment of learning about our own sense of culture and cultural identity. You know, it's hard for me to understand and appreciate and value your sense of culture if I don't have a sense of my own culture. And that, again, is both individually as well as organizationally. The last two pieces I'm just going to combine together, and that's CQ strategy and CQ action. And that actually plays into what I said before about, you know, interrupting the usual. Once we've got this information about culture and cultural difference, it's got to be more than just head knowledge and heart knowledge. We've got to do something with it. And that's where this idea of developing clear strategies and actions, goals that we're working towards to change our organizational culture. I mean, I'll give you an example from the educational arena. All right, so I like to think that I'm most days a pretty culturally intelligent person. There was a time early in my teaching career, I taught this course on our main campus, and the demographic for that course was 18 to 22-year-old students. And I kind of had that course down to a science. And so then I was asked to teach it in a larger, more urban, more African-American and teaching environment, where actually, as the 30-year-old professor at that time, I was the young person in the room. I think the next closest person to me in age in terms of a student was 10 years my senior. And I remember first walking into that class thinking, public speaking is public speaking. And so I can teach this class the same way I taught it on the main campus. No, you can't, because the audience in front of me is not 18 to 22-year-olds. Yeah, while the basic parts of the speech are the same, and that doesn't change, there are things about the course that need to change. The examples and references that I use, maybe the assignments that I use, or maybe the length of the assignments, or, you know, all of those sorts of things are things that, you know, I wasn't trying to be culturally insensitive. In fact, that was the audience that I looked the most alike and had the most in common with. But I did not initially teach it from a culturally sensitive or a culturally intelligent space. And again, that's what I like, is that there's room for all of us to learn. It's not like I get from CQ drive to CQ action, I can check it off and I've got it, I'm done. It's ongoing. The learning is ongoing.
Yeah, I can relate. I was just in a conversation where someone quoted something from, I think, an old Mary Poppins movie, and everyone in the room was silent. No one got the reference. That can definitely happen. So we're going to open it up pretty soon here for questions from anyone to go ahead, and I think there's a place on the screen there where you can type those in, and Jennifer's going to be monitoring those. I just had two more quick questions. So is there anyone out there doing what you've just been talking about well that we could look to and go, there's a shining example?
Well, you know, again, I mentioned you know, a couple of examples, but I think what's important before I start singling out some companies is to realize that you're dealing with people, and people are messy, people are problematic. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right?
Right.
And so, you know, I'm sure many in our audience today are aware of the situation that occurred at the Starbucks in Philadelphia, which then led to them doing the one-day shutdown implicit bias training. I had a chance to not be a part of the training, but to review a lot of those materials. And again, for some people, who had different opinions on, just even the nature of implicit bias, they thought it was a great training. Others thought it, lacked something. But I think Starbucks, is trying to do something. Now, that being said, I'm sure some people maybe saw a headline the other day where there was a customer who stutters and had gone into Starbucks, and one of the baristas offensively wrote kind of their name in stutter on the cup. And so you're sitting there saying, wait a minute, the company just shut down for a day to do this conversation. But guess what? There are times when people have the experience and they miss the meaning. And that's clearly an example of an employee who had the experience but missed the meaning. I think I was sharing with you before we came online, just watched a great program the other day from Facebook, again, doing a session on implicit bias. Another resource, and I am not under contract with the Cultural Intelligence Center, but I think they've got a wealth of information. David Livermore has worked with government entities, major corporations, higher education institutions, all around that framework of helping them to become more culturally intelligent in the work that they do. And I can't say anything more favorably about them. There's some great TED Talks out there that people can use to, I know we're kind of pressed for time on today, but if people want to dig deeper on any of these subjects that we've talked about, there's some great TED Talks out there that organizations can use, at their leisure to engage their employees in deeper thought on this. One of my favorites, is the one done by Melody Hobson on being colorblind or color brave. I think it's a great way to just even start the conversation of what do we mean as an organization by difference, or diversity and inclusion, and why does it matter?
Yeah, and why does it matter? I think that's where we're going to end on this last question before we go to any questions that we might have from our listeners. So you mentioned people are messy, and sometimes I'll give you an example in my life. If there are 3 things in front of me and 2 of them are hard and 1 of them is easy, like gravity, I am pulled towards the easiest task. Right. And some of the things we've talked about today require some real change and some hard work and some careful analysis and some change that has to take place. So I'm not necessarily drawn to these things because I know it's going to be some hard work. What if I put this off, or if I just say, well, that just can't be my priority today? In what way am I taking risks?
Well, I think you're missing out. In fact, I think you're making it harder than it needs to be. I again, like I said, I come at this through the lens of education. So I often say when I'm talking with some of my colleagues in education, whatever their discipline is, there's a reason that you went on for further education in that, and that you're passionate about that and love that field, your love of learning, right? Why would you allow unnecessary obstacles to get in the way of sharing that love, that passion that you have with others? So as you think about your work in the print and mailing industry, there are things that you enjoy, that you're passionate about in that. There are skill sets that you have that others do not have, that you see the value in, that you see the transferability in. And you want that field to continue. You want your organization, whatever that organization is, to continue to be a leader in that. Why would you put unnecessary obstacles in the way of that? And so, again, if you know that the challenges are we're getting older, or that the region is growing more ethnically diverse, or whatever the case might be, and that there's going to be a demand, a need for employees, why am I going to make things harder on myself 5-10 years down the road by not embracing it right now?
Thank you. This has been a great time. I can't believe it's gone so quickly. Jennifer, you've been monitoring. Are there any questions coming in?
No, I just think that maybe the cultural website that you were talking about, if you would go ahead and give our attendees time to grab a pen and maybe give them that website again.
Sure. I will put that slide back up. That one there?
Yep.
Sure. It's www.culturalq.com. Or
That looks like an excellent source.
Yeah, it is outstanding. And again, if you forget that, if you just remember David Livermore or Cultural Intelligence Center, that will lead you to a variety of resources. And in fact, their organization also does some trainings where they take you a little deeper on that model. For our time today, I just sort of skimmed the surface on it. But what I found is it's a very helpful framework for organizations and for departments to talk about what their commitment to diversity and inclusion is, why they have that commitment, and then identifying clear strategies or actions that can help you live out that commitment.
Great. Okay, Jennifer, would you like to wrap us up then?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Allen. Thank you, Dwayne. We appreciate very interesting information. I want to thank everyone for coming to the webinar today. Just a reminder, we did announce that we are going to Louisville, Kentucky in June 2019. Going to be staying at the historical Galt House Hotel, so we're very, very excited about that. I'm going to let you know that our next IPMA webinar will be July 22nd, 1:30 p.m. Central. It will be our IPMA virtual chapter meeting, hosted by Mr. Christopher Donlin himself of the Kohler Company. He is also the IPMA Wisconsin chapter president. He serves on the IPMA awards chair, and he is a longtime member and faithful friend of IPMA. The presentation will be Dreams by Shanna Farrell of Fox Valley Technical College. If you happen to be at our last webinar, it was really interesting. We do have a couple of her blogs posted on our website and on the community. You can go to IPMA.org under resources and click on blogs, and you can find some of her blogs. So inspiring. You guys, I just want to thank you so much again. Looking forward to seeing all of you in Kentucky. Have a great day.
Thank you.